Last spring, I was clearing out the last of her things, a small cedar box I'd seen 100 times but never opened. Inside was a photograph. A man I didn't recognize, standing beside her, maybe 1962. She was laughing in a way I'd never seen in any family photo. On the back, in her careful handwriting, just 2 words and a city. No explanation. No name. She passed 14 months ago, and I thought I knew her story completely. I thought our family did. Turns out, there was an entire life she carried quietly and chose, for reasons I'm still learning to understand, to keep only for herself. It was a Tuesday in April when we finally went back to clear out her house. My daughter drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the familiar road go by. The gas station on the corner of Elm, the old diner that changed owners twice but kept the same sign, the stretch of highway where the fields open up before you reach your neighborhood. I had driven that road my whole life. That morning it felt longer than usual. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said in the 14 months since she passed. Grief has a way of doing that. It empties out the words first. Then slowly, over time, it starts returning them, different ones, quieter ones. Her house looked the same from the outside. It always did. Small white ranch, black shutters, the rose bush along the front walk that she tended every spring without fail. Someone had been keeping it trimmed. I didn't ask who. I wasn't ready to ask small questions like that yet. My daughter unlocked the door. We stepped inside. The house smelled like her. I wasn't prepared for that. 14 months, and still, the faint trace of her hand lotion, the particular stillness of rooms that have been lived in slowly, carefully, over many decades. Some smells don't leave quickly. I stood in the entryway for a moment and just breathed. We had a system. My daughter would take the kitchen and the living room. I would take the bedroom and the hall closet. We had done this kind of work before after my father-in-law passed, after my own mother. You learn how to move through it. You learn to keep your hands busy and let your mind follow along at its own pace. The bedroom was neat. She had always been neat. Drawers organized, closet arranged by season, shoes lined up in a row. I worked slowly. I folded things that didn't need folding. I took my time with each drawer, each shelf. There is something that feels almost sacred about handling a person's belongings after they are gone. You want to be careful. You want to be respectful. You are touching what they touched every ordinary day of their life. The top shelf of her closet held boxes. Hat boxes, shoe boxes, a few cardboard ones labeled in her handwriting. Christmas cards. Insurance documents. Photographs, family. I set them aside in a careful stack. I would go through them later, at home, when I had more time and more composure. Then I saw the cedar box. It was pushed to the back, behind the shoe boxes, sitting on a folded wool blanket. Small. Maybe 10 inches wide. The wood was smooth and dark with age, the kind of cedar that goes almost reddish-brown over the years. I had seen it before. I was almost certain I had. It had been on that shelf or somewhere in this house for as long as I could remember. I had simply never thought about it. I lifted it down carefully. It was heavier than I expected. I stood there holding it for a moment. I wasn't thinking anything in particular. I wasn't expecting anything. It was just another item to sort through, another piece of her life to account for. I set it on the bed beside me and sat down. The latch was a small brass hook. Simple. I turned it without thinking twice. Inside, there was a folded handkerchief on top. White cotton, embroidered edges. Below it, a few small items. A pressed flower, dried completely flat and pale, the color long gone. A folded piece of paper that I didn't open right away. And underneath everything, a photograph. I picked up the photograph. It was black and white. Old. The edges had that soft, slightly rounded look that old photos get, as if time softens the corners of things. 2 people standing outside somewhere, a street, maybe, or the front of a building. The image was small but clear enough. One of them was her. She looked young. 30 maybe. Somewhere in that territory. She was wearing a light-colored dress, her hair done in the style of that era, and she was laughing. Not smiling. Laughing. Her head was tilted back just slightly, and her eyes were bright, and I sat there on the edge of her bed staring at that laugh, because I had never seen it before. Not in 60 years of family photographs. Not once. The man beside her was tall, dark-haired. He was looking at her, not at the camera. His expression was, I don't know the exact word. Fond. Easy. The way you look at someone you know very well. I did not recognize him. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in her handwriting, that careful, even cursive she used her whole life, were 2 words. And a city. Nothing else. No date. No last name. No explanation. I sat with it for a long time. My daughter called from the kitchen asking if I wanted coffee. I said yes, without thinking. I heard her moving around in there, opening and closing cabinets, the familiar sound of water running. Normal sounds. Regular afternoon sounds. I looked at the photograph again. I thought about all the times I had sat at her kitchen table. All the Sunday dinners, the holidays, the ordinary Saturdays. I thought about how well I believed I knew her. The shape of her days, the sound of her voice in the morning, the particular way she stirred her tea. I thought I had a complete picture. I did not have a complete picture. I placed the photograph gently back in the box. I set the box on my lap and held it with both hands. Outside the window, the rosebush was just beginning to bud. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, the kind that makes everything look a little warmer than it is. She had kept this her whole life. Whatever it was, whoever he was, she had kept it through a marriage, through children, through grandchildren, through decades of ordinary and difficult and joyful days. She had carried it all the way to the end. And then she had left it behind, on a shelf, in a cedar box, in the back of a closet. I don't know if she meant for someone to find it. I don't know if she hoped someone would. I closed the lid and sat quietly for a while. The house settled around me the way old houses do. And for the first time in 14 months, I felt like I was just beginning to grieve her. I have been thinking about how we construct a person in our minds. Not consciously. We don't sit down and decide who someone is. It happens slowly, over years, built from small repeated moments. The way they take their coffee. The expression they make when they disagree with something but choose not to say so. The particular way they move through a kitchen. You collect these things without realizing it, and somewhere along the way you decide you know a person. Fully. Completely. I thought I knew her that way. Her name was Eleanor. Everyone called her Ellie except her oldest friends, who still called her by a childhood nickname I could never quite bring myself to use. She was born in 1931 in a small town in Ohio. She lived most of her adult life in the same county she grew up in. She died at 91 in the house she had shared with my grandfather for 54 years, in the bedroom with the white curtains she had sewn herself sometime in the late 1970s and never replaced. She was not a dramatic woman. That is the first thing I would tell anyone who asked about her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make scenes. When something upset her, she went quiet in a particular way, not cold, not punishing, just contained. She would set her jaw slightly and redirect her attention to something useful. Dishes. A crossword puzzle. The garden. She processed things privately and emerged later, composed, ready to continue. We respected that about her. We also, I think, used it as an excuse not to ask questions. She had a dry humor that caught you off guard. That was one of her best qualities. She would say something so quietly funny that you almost missed it, and then she'd go back to whatever she was doing, as if nothing had happened. My grandfather used to look at her after those moments with an expression of pure delight, like he never quite got used to it, even after all those years. She was generous, but not showy about it. She remembered birthdays with handwritten cards, always mailed 3 days early. She kept a running mental list of what everyone in the family liked and didn't like, foods, colors, small preferences, and she honored those lists without ever making you feel managed. She noticed people. That was her particular gift. She paid attention in a way that was steady and quiet and completely reliable. She was also, I understand now, deeply private. At the time I didn't frame it that way. Private sounds deliberate. What I thought was that she was simply of a generation that didn't overshare. Women her age didn't narrate their inner lives the way people do now. They didn't process out loud. They didn't post their feelings or sit around analyzing their own histories over dinner. That was just how they were raised, I told myself. That was the era. I used that explanation comfortably for a long time. There were moments, though. Small ones. I can see them differently now.
There was a song she didn't like.
It came on the radio once when I was visiting her, sometime in the early 1990s, an old standard, the kind that played in the background of that era. She reached over without a word and changed the station. Smoothly, quickly, no explanation. I was in my 30s and I noticed it but didn't ask. It seemed like a small preference. Now I wonder. There was a city she never wanted to visit. My grandfather had suggested it once, a road trip, some anniversary. She declined with a reason I can't remember now. Something practical. He didn't push. They went somewhere else instead. I was there for that conversation, and I remember thinking she seemed unusually firm about it. That's all. Unusually firm. And then the moment passed, and I forgot it until the cedar box. She had a way of ending certain conversations.
Not rudely.
She was never rude. But if a topic moved in a direction she didn't want to follow, she would simply redirect. Offer something else. Ask a question that moved things along. She did it so gracefully that you rarely noticed you had been guided.
She was very good at that.
I thought it was social skill. I thought it was politeness. I think now that some of it was practice. She never talked much about her early 20s. We knew the broad outline, grew up in Ohio, met my grandfather, married young, had children in quick succession. That was the story. That was what had been handed down. Nobody in my family ever thought to probe it because it fit the pattern of women's lives in that era.
You didn't need more detail.
The shape of it made sense. I am sitting here now, at my own kitchen table, thinking about all the things I never asked her. I never asked what she wanted to be when she was young. I never asked about her friendships before she married. I never asked what her 20s felt like from the inside, not the facts of them, but the texture.
The weight.
The desires she had before the life she built took a particular shape. I didn't ask because it didn't occur to me to ask. And she, for her part, didn't offer. I don't say that with resentment.
I want to be clear about that.
There is no anger in what I feel when I think about her silences now. What I feel is closer to sorrow. A gentle kind. The kind that comes from realizing too late that there were whole rooms in a person you loved and you never even tried the door. She was a wonderful grandmother, a steady wife, a careful mother. All of that was real. All of that was genuinely and fully her. I am not revising the woman I knew. I am expanding her. I am making room in my understanding for a version of her that existed before any of us did. A young woman with a private history and reasons for her silences that she chose, deliberately, never to explain. Silence can be protection. It can be grief. It can be a decision made once, long ago, and honored every single day afterward, without complaint. I didn't understand that about her when she was alive. I am beginning to understand it now. I've been thinking about questions lately. Not the kind you ask out loud, but the ones that sit quietly in the back of your mind and never quite make it to your lips. When I was a child, I didn't think to ask my grandmother much about her life. She was just there, steady as the kitchen clock, always moving, always doing something useful with her hands. I assumed she had always been exactly the way I knew her, soft-spoken, patient, and a little tired around the eyes. She used to sit by the window in the late afternoons. Same chair, same spot where the sunlight would fall across her lap. I remember how she would fold things, napkins, old dish towels, sometimes even pieces of paper, carefully, like each crease mattered. I never asked why she saved those scraps or why she handled them with such care. Children don't think like that. They don't imagine that older people were ever young in ways that mattered. I remember asking her once, when I was maybe 8 or 9, what she used to do when she was my age. She smiled, but it was a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, the same things you do," she said. "Ran around, got into trouble now and then." That was all. No stories, no details. Just a simple answer that closed the door without making a sound. And I didn't push it. None of us did. Looking back, I realize how easily we accepted that. We took what she offered and never thought to look for what she held back. It felt respectful at the time. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just easier that way. She told stories sometimes, but they were always the same kind. Safe ones. Stories about baking bread with her mother, about winters that lasted too long, about neighbors whose names I can't remember now. They were pleasant, but they felt edited. Even as a child, I think I sensed it. There were spaces in her stories, little pauses where something might have been, but wasn't. I remember noticing how she would sometimes stop mid-sentence, then pick up somewhere else, like she had quietly stepped around something invisible. At the time, I didn't know what that meant. I just thought that was how stories worked. Now I'm not so sure. There was one afternoon that comes back to me more clearly than the others. I must have been around 12. Old enough to notice things, but not old enough to understand them. She was in the kitchen, standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot. The window was open just a little, and I could hear the wind moving through the trees outside. It was quiet in that ordinary way that homes used to be, before everything started buzzing and ringing. I was sitting at the table, watching her. "You ever want to go somewhere else?" I asked her. I don't know why I asked that. It just slipped out. She didn't answer right away. She kept stirring, slow and steady, like she hadn't heard me. But I knew she had. After a moment, she said, "Everyone thinks about that at some point."
Her voice was calm.
Too calm. "Did you?" I asked. That time, she stopped stirring. Just for a second. Then she started again. "Yes," she said. "A long time ago." I waited for her to say more, but she didn't. The spoon kept moving in that same steady circle. The smell of whatever she was cooking filled the room, warm and familiar. I remember feeling something then. Not disappointment exactly. More like standing at the edge of something and realizing you weren't allowed to step any closer.
So I let it go.
That's what we always did. We let things go. It's strange, the things you notice only after someone is gone. Little habits, small silences, the way certain topics would drift away before they ever settled into conversation. There were moments, brief ones, when it felt like she might say something more. Like the words were right there, just behind her teeth. But then she would smile, or change the subject, or ask you a question instead.
She was good at that.
Redirecting. Gently, without making it obvious. I don't think she meant to keep us at a distance. Not in a cold way. If anything, she was the opposite of that. She was always present, always attentive. She remembered birthdays, favorite foods, the small things that made each of us feel seen. But there was a part of her that remained untouched. Not hidden in a dramatic way. Just set aside. Like that drawer. Funny how the mind works. I hadn't thought about that drawer in years. The one she kept closed. The one none of us were supposed to open. It was in her bedroom, tucked into the corner of that old wooden dresser. Not locked, as far as I knew. Just understood. "Leave that one alone," she would say, if she ever caught you too close. She never raised her voice.
She didn't need to.
There was something in the way she said it, firm, but quiet, that made you step back without question.
We respected that.
Or maybe we were just used to it. I remember once, during one of those long summer visits, I stood in her room when she wasn't there. I must have been 15 or 16 by then. Old enough to be curious in a different way. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. I walked over to the dresser. Slowly, like I was afraid it might make a sound. My hand hovered over the drawer for a moment. I can still remember how that felt. The hesitation. Not fear exactly. More like the sense that I was crossing into something that didn't belong to me. I almost opened it, but I didn't. I told myself it was respect, that it wasn't my place. And maybe that was true. But now, standing here years later, I wonder if it was something else too. Maybe I was afraid of what I might find. Not because I expected anything terrible, just different. Something that would change the way I saw her. It's easier, I think, to keep people in the shape we know them. Grandmother. Caregiver. The one who makes everything feel steady. Not a young woman who once stood somewhere else, wanting something she never spoke about. We never asked her who she had been before all of this. And she never told us. There's a kind of quiet agreement in families sometimes. An understanding that certain things will remain unspoken. Not out of secrecy, exactly. More out of habit. You live your life. You take what is given. You don't go looking for what isn't offered. I followed that without even realizing it.
Until now.
Now I find myself going back through those memories, turning them over, looking at them from different angles, trying to see what I missed. The pauses, the careful way she chose her words, the questions she answered just enough to satisfy, but never enough to reveal. It wasn't distance. Not really. It was control. A gentle kind of control. The kind that keeps a life neatly folded, like those napkins she used to press smooth with her hands. I used to think I knew her completely. Now I'm not so sure I knew her at all. And the strangest part is, I don't feel betrayed by that. Just aware. Aware of how much can exist beneath the surface of a person. How whole a life can be, even when only pieces of it are shared. If I could go back, I don't know if I would ask her more questions. Maybe I would. Or maybe I'd still sit there at the table, watching her stir something on the stove, waiting for her to tell me only what she was willing to give. Some silences aren't meant to be broken, but they do leave an echo. And now, for the first time, I think I'm starting to hear it. I didn't open the box right away. I carried it out of her room and set it on the dining table, the same table where she used to sort through coupons and grocery lists. It looked smaller there than it had in my hands. Just a simple wooden thing. Worn smooth at the edges, like it had been handled often, but carefully. The house was quiet again. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that reminds you someone is missing. I made myself a cup of tea out of habit. Set it down beside the box. Didn't drink it. I sat there for a long time just looking at it. It didn't seem important in the way you expect important things to look. No shine. No decoration. Just that small brass clasp on the front, dull with age. I ran my thumb over it once or twice, feeling the cool metal. I thought about putting it back. That crossed my mind more than once. Closing everything up. Leaving her room the way it had always been. Letting whatever she kept inside that box stay hers. But I didn't do that either. Instead, I went back to the bedroom and stood by the dresser again. The drawer was still open from earlier. That felt strange to see. She would never have left it that way. I looked inside more carefully this time. There were things I hadn't paid attention to before. Old envelopes, tied together with a thin piece of string. A folded handkerchief, yellowed at the edges. And tucked into the corner, almost out of sight, a small key. I knew what it was for the moment I saw it. It wasn't hidden exactly. Just placed somewhere you wouldn't notice unless you were looking closely. I picked it up and held it in my palm. It was lighter than I expected. The kind of key you don't see much anymore. Simple, narrow, a little worn down. For a second, I just stood there with it. I remember thinking how ordinary it felt. How something so small could open something I had never been meant to see. I brought it back to the table. The tea had gone cold by then. I didn't bother to make another cup. I sat down again and pulled the box closer. The wood made a soft sound against the table, barely more than a whisper. My hands weren't shaking. I noticed that. I thought maybe they would be, but they were steady. I turned the key over once between my fingers, then slid it into the lock. It fit easily. No resistance. There was a quiet click when I turned it. That sound stayed with me. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just final. I rested my hand on the lid for a moment before opening it. The wood felt warm, like it had been holding on to the heat of the room. I don't know what I expected to find inside. Something heavy, maybe. Something that would explain everything all at once. But when I lifted the lid, it was just paper. Letters. Stacked neatly. Some tied with ribbon, others loose. A few envelopes with stamps I didn't recognize. The edges were soft from age, corners slightly bent. There was a faint smell. Not unpleasant. Just old. Like books that have been sitting on a shelf for a long time. I didn't touch anything at first. I just looked. There's a certain feeling that comes when you realize you're seeing something no one else has seen in years. Maybe decades. It doesn't feel like discovery. It feels more like being allowed into a quiet place you weren't meant to enter. I reached in and picked up the top letter. The paper was thinner than what we use now. Fragile almost. I had to be careful not to bend it too much. The handwriting caught my attention right away. It wasn't hers. I knew her handwriting well. Rounded, steady, a little slanted to the right. This was different. The letters were tighter, more deliberate. A little uneven in places, like the writer had been trying to be careful. I turned the envelope over. No name on the outside. No address I recognized. Just the stamp, faded enough that I couldn't make out the details. I slid the letter out slowly. For a moment, I just held it there, unfolded. It felt private in a way I hadn't expected. Not secret, exactly. Just personal. Like stepping into someone else's conversation. I almost put it back. That thought came and went quickly, but it was there. Then I unfolded it. The crease in the paper was soft, like it had been opened and closed many times before. I read the first line, and then I stopped. I didn't read it out loud. I didn't move. I just sat there, looking at those words, letting them settle in my mind. It wasn't what the line said, exactly. It was how it felt, familiar somehow, and unfamiliar at the same time. I realized, sitting there at that table, that I was reading something written to a version of her I had never known. Not my grandmother. Someone else. Someone younger. Someone who existed long before I did. I read a little further. The tone was gentle, thoughtful. There was a kind of care in the way the words were arranged. Not rushed. Not casual. It didn't feel like a letter meant to be skimmed. I found myself slowing down, reading each line carefully, as if I might miss something if I went too fast. There were small details mentioned. Places. Moments. Things that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant something to them. I didn't recognize the names. That struck me more than anything else. An entire set of names, of places, of memories, and none of them belonged to the life I knew. I set the letter down after a while. Not because I was overwhelmed, just because I needed a moment. I looked back at the box. There were more letters underneath. Dozens maybe, all arranged with the same quiet care. This hadn't been forgotten. This had been kept. I thought about her, sitting in that chair by the window, folding things with those steady hands. Had she read these often? Had she gone back to them on certain days, certain evenings when the house was quiet? I tried to picture it, her taking the box out, opening it the same way I had, lifting each letter, unfolding it slowly. I wondered if she read them the same way every time, or if she already knew every word by heart.
There was no way to know.
I picked the letter up again and read it from the beginning. This time, I paid attention to the spaces between the lines, the pauses, the things that weren't said directly, but were there if you looked closely. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with big declarations or heavy words. It was simple, but it carried something steady underneath it, something that had lasted long enough to be folded, kept, and hidden away all these years. I read until the end of the page. Then I turned it over, half expecting more. There wasn't any.
Just that single sheet.
I sat back in the chair and let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The house was still quiet. The tea beside me had gone completely cold. And the box sat open in front of me, no longer just a box. I didn't rush to the next letter. I stayed there for a while, holding that first one in my hands, feeling the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with paper. It wasn't answers I was holding. Not yet. Just a beginning. And for the first time, I understood that whatever I was about to learn, it had been waiting here all along. Folded neatly. Kept out of sight. Not lost. Just left behind. I didn't read all the letters at once. That would have felt wrong. Like rushing through something that had taken years to become what it was. Instead, I took them one at a time. Slow. Careful. The way she used to do most things. I went back to the box later that evening. The light had started to fade by then, and the house had that soft, dim look it gets just before night settles in. I turned on the lamp near the table. Not the overhead light. She never liked that one much. The box was exactly where I had left it. Open. That still felt unusual to me. She was a woman who closed things. Drawers, doors, conversations. Everything had its place, and everything was kept in order. I pulled out another letter. This one was folded a little differently, not as crisp as the first. The edges were softer, like it had been handled more often.
Again, the same handwriting.
Careful. Intentional. I unfolded it slowly. The words came easier this time. Not because they were simpler, but because I had already crossed that first line. Already stepped into that space.
There were small details again.
Mentions of a street I didn't recognize. A diner. A bus stop. Ordinary places, described in a way that made them feel held onto. I could see it in a way. Not clearly, but enough. Two people meeting in quiet places. Talking about everyday things. Stretching time in small ways. There was no rush in the writing. No urgency. Just a steady presence. Like someone who expected to be heard, even if the words took time to arrive. I paused halfway through and looked up from the page. It felt strange, sitting there in her house, reading about moments that had happened long before any of us were part of her life. I tried to imagine her then, not as the woman I knew, but younger, standing somewhere unfamiliar, maybe waiting, maybe deciding something she hadn't said out loud yet. It's not easy to do that. To take someone you've known your whole life and reshape them into a version you've never seen. But the letters made it possible. Not completely. Just enough. I kept reading. There were hints of closeness. Not stated directly. Nothing that called attention to itself.
Just small things.
The way a name was written. The way certain moments were described with a little more care. I noticed how often the writer referred to time. Not enough of it. Too much of it. Waiting for it. That stayed with me. Time in those letters didn't feel simple. It felt like something they were both aware of. Something that mattered more than it should have. I folded the letter back along its original crease and set it beside the first. Then I reached for another. This one was older, I think. The paper had a different texture. Slightly rougher. The ink had faded more in places. The handwriting was the same, but less steady. I wondered if that meant anything. If it said something about the moment it was written. I read more carefully this time. There were changes in tone. Subtle, but there. Less lightness. More pauses. Sentences that didn't quite finish their thought before moving on to the next. I could feel it without fully understanding it. Something had shifted. I set that letter down more slowly. The room had grown darker around me. The lamp cast a small circle of light across the table, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. I didn't turn on another light. It felt right to keep things this way. Quiet.
Contained.
I thought about her again. About the stories she told us. How simple they always were. How complete they sounded on the surface. And how none of what I was reading now had ever been part of those stories. Not even in passing. It wasn't that she had lied. She just left things out.
Carefully. Consistently.
I reached back into the box and gathered a small stack of letters this time. Not all of them. Just enough to see if the pattern continued. I didn't read them all the way through. Not yet. I skimmed. Dates caught my eye. They stretched over a longer period than I expected. Not just a few months. Not something brief. This had lasted. Whatever it was. I felt that more than anything else. Something that had stayed. I picked one letter from the middle of the stack and opened it. This one was shorter. The sentences were more direct. There was a mention of leaving. Not clearly explained. Just referenced. Like something both people already understood. I read that line twice. Then a third time. It didn't say why. It didn't need to. There was a kind of acceptance in the words that followed. Not easy acceptance. Just quiet. The kind that comes when a decision has already been made, even if it hasn't been spoken aloud yet. I set the letter down and rested my hand on top of it.
I didn't feel shocked.
That surprised me. I thought I might, but what I felt instead was something slower. A gradual understanding, still forming. Like watching something come into focus, one small piece at a time. I looked back at the box. At all the letters still inside. This wasn't just a story. It was a part of her life. A full part. One that had been lived, not imagined. Chosen, not accidental. And then, at some point, left behind. I tried to place it. Where did it fit?
Before us, clearly.
Before the version of her that I knew. But how far before? And what had come after? I realized then that I didn't know as much about her timeline as I thought I did. We knew the broad things. Where she lived.
When she married.
when she had children. But the spaces in between those things, we never really filled them in.
We didn't ask.
And she didn't offer. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Not out of tiredness, just to sit with it. A younger version of her, somewhere I had never been. With someone whose name I didn't recognize. Living a life that had nothing to do with the one I grew up inside. It didn't feel like a betrayal. That wasn't the word. It felt human. Simple, in a way I hadn't expected. People live whole lives before they become who we know them as.
We just don't always think about that.
I opened my eyes again and reached for the first letter I had read. I looked at it differently now. Not as a single piece, but as the beginning of something that stretched further than I had realized. I didn't know the full shape of it yet, but I could feel it forming. A life before us. Not separate, just earlier. And for the first time, I understood that whatever she had carried into the years we shared with her, it hadn't started there. It had come from somewhere else. I didn't notice the shift all at once. It came slowly, letter by letter. A word here, a sentence there. Something in the tone began to change.
Not sharply.
Not in a way that would catch your attention if you weren't already looking for it. But I was looking. By then, I had fallen into a kind of rhythm. I would sit at the table in the late afternoon, the same way she used to sit by the window. I'd open the box, take out 1 or 2 letters, and read them carefully. Then I would put them back before evening came. I didn't rush. It felt important not to. The house stayed quiet during those hours. The kind of quiet that holds steady, without asking anything of you. Sometimes I could hear a car pass on the road outside, or the faint sound of a door closing somewhere down the street. Mostly, though, it was just me and those pages. The earlier letters had a softness to them, a kind of ease. Even when they spoke about time or distance, there was still something open in the way the words were written. That began to fade. The sentences grew shorter, more careful. I noticed how often things were left unfinished. Thoughts that trailed off. Lines that seemed to stop just before they reached something that might have been difficult to say. It wasn't confusion. It felt like restraint. I picked up one letter in particular. I remember it clearly because of the way the paper felt. Slightly thicker than the others. The fold was sharper, as if it had been opened fewer times. The handwriting was tighter. I unfolded it and read. There was a mention of a conversation. Not described in detail. Just enough to understand that something had been said. Something that mattered. I read that part twice. Then I went back to the beginning and read the whole letter again more slowly. There was a weight to it. Not heavy in a dramatic sense. Just steady. Like something that had settled and wasn't going to move again. I could feel it in the spaces between the lines. A decision had been made. Not announced. Not explained. Just there. I set the letter down and looked out toward the window. The light had started to shift by then. Late afternoon, moving toward evening. The same time of day she used to sit and fold things in her lap. I tried to imagine her reading this. Holding this exact page. Did she sit in that same chair? Did she read it once and put it away? Or did she come back to it, the way I was beginning to do with some of them? There was no way to know. But I had a feeling she didn't read these casually. Nothing about this felt casual. I reached for another letter. This one was longer. The handwriting was less steady again. Not messy, just uneven. As if the person writing had paused often. Maybe thinking. Maybe choosing what to say and what to leave out. There were more direct words in this one. Still quiet. Still measured. But clearer. A sense of something ending. Not suddenly. Not with finality in the way people often describe endings. More like something that had been slowly coming to a close for a while, finally reaching the point where it couldn't continue in the same way. I read a line about what comes next. It wasn't detailed, just mentioned almost in passing. But it stayed with me. What comes next? I leaned back in the chair and let that sit for a moment. Because I knew what had come next. At least, I knew part of it. Her life, as I had known it. The house. The routines. The quiet consistency. The way she moved through each day with a kind of steady purpose. All of that had come after this. After these letters. After whatever decision had been made between the lines. I looked back at the pages in front of me. It's a strange thing, realizing that the life you knew someone for wasn't the only life they lived. Not even the first. There's a kind of humility in that. You start to see how much you never asked, how much you assumed. I picked up another letter. This one was shorter than the others. The paper had a slight crease near the corner, like it had been folded more than once in a hurry. The words were simple. There was a goodbye in it. Not the kind that announces itself. No long explanations. No attempts to soften what was being said. Just a quiet acknowledgement. A closing. I read it once. Then again. The second time, I noticed something I had missed before. There was no bitterness in it. No blame. Just acceptance. That struck me more than anything else. Because acceptance isn't easy. Not when something matters. Not when something has lasted. And this had lasted. I had seen enough of the dates to know that. This wasn't something brief. Not something that came and went without leaving a mark. It had been part of her life for a long time. And then, at some point, she had chosen to step away from it. Or maybe she had no choice. I couldn't say for sure. The letters didn't explain that part directly. They didn't need to. Sometimes you can feel the shape of a decision without being told the details. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. For a moment, I rested my hand on top of the stack. There was a weight there. Not physical. Something else. The weight of something carried quietly. Something lived with, not spoken about. I thought about her again. About the way she moved through her days. How steady she always seemed. How composed. There had been no sign of this. Not in any obvious way. No stories that hinted at it. No moments where she let something slip. She had kept this part of her life separate. Not hidden in a way that felt secretive. Just contained. Like those letters. Folded. Placed in a box. Set aside. I wondered what that took.
To make a choice like that.
To step away from something that had been part of you for so long. And then to go on. To build a life that looked complete from the outside. To become the person everyone else knew. It didn't feel like loss in the way I expected. It felt like discipline. A quiet kind of strength. The kind that doesn't draw attention to itself. I looked around the room. Everything in it felt familiar. The table. The chairs. The small marks on the wood that had been there for as long as I could remember. This was the life she had chosen. Or the life that had followed her choice. And it had been a good life. A full one. There was no doubt about that. But now I understood that it had been built on top of something else. Something that had come before. Something she had decided to leave behind. I didn't feel sadness. Not exactly. What I felt was something quieter. A kind of respect. For the way she had carried it. For the way she had never let it disturb the life she lived afterward. For the way she had kept it folded away, not out of denial, but out of care. I closed the lid of the box gently. The sound it made was soft. Almost nothing. But it marked something. Not an ending. Just a pause. Because I knew there was still more to understand. More letters. More pieces. But now, at least, I could see the shape of it. A choice had been made. A life had shifted. And everything that came after had grown from that quiet moment, held between the lines. I stopped reading for a day or two after that. Not because I was overwhelmed. It wasn't that kind of feeling. It was quieter than that. More like something had settled, and I needed to let it sit where it was before I moved it again. The box stayed on the table.
Closed.
I walked past it a few times. Not avoiding it. Just aware of it. The house felt different now. Not in a way anyone else would notice. The same furniture, the same light coming through the windows in the morning. But something underneath had shifted. A layer I hadn't known was there had come into view. I found myself thinking about her in small moments. The way she used to rinse her teacup before setting it in the sink. Always a quick rinse, even if it was already clean. The way she folded her sweaters at the end of winter. Not packed away, just placed gently on the shelf, like she expected to see them again soon. She never rushed those things. She didn't rush much of anything. I wondered if that was part of it. Not just her habits, but the way she held on to things without letting them spill over into the rest of her life. There's a difference between forgetting and setting something aside. I don't think she ever forgot. That thought came to me one morning while I was standing at the kitchen counter. I had just made coffee, and the smell filled the room in that familiar way. For a second, it felt like she might walk in and ask if I'd made enough for two. But of course she didn't. And I realized then that nothing in her life had ever felt unfinished to me. That was the strange part. She never seemed like someone carrying something unresolved. No restlessness. No sense of something missing.
She was complete.
At least, that's how she appeared to us. I went back to the table later that afternoon and opened the box again. The letters were just as I had left them, neatly stacked, quiet. I didn't pick one up right away. I just sat there looking at them, thinking about what I had already read, about the decision, about the ending that hadn't felt like an ending so much as a closing of a door. And then I thought about everything that came after. Her marriage, her children, the life that eventually included me. All of it had been built without any sign of what came before. Not hidden, just not included. I reached for one of the later letters. I hadn't read many from that part of the stack yet. The paper felt the same, but the tone had changed. Even before I unfolded it, I could sense that. I read slowly. There wasn't much said in that letter. Just a few lines. A kind of checking in. A quiet acknowledgement of distance. No mention of returning. No suggestion that anything would be revisited. Just a steady acceptance of where things now stood. I folded it back carefully. And then it became clearer to me. She hadn't told us about this part of her life because it didn't belong to the life she chose to live afterward. Not in a harsh way. Not as something she rejected, but as something she had already placed where it needed to be. In the past. Complete. I sat there for a while with that thought. It didn't feel like secrecy anymore. It felt like intention.
There's a kind of discipline in that.
To take something meaningful, something that shaped you, and decide not to carry it forward in a way that changes everything else. To let it stay where it happened. I thought about the times she almost said something. Because now, looking back, I could see them more clearly. Little pauses in conversation. Moments where her eyes would shift slightly, like she was remembering something just out of reach. I used to think those were just signs of age. The way memory drifts sometimes. But now I wasn't so sure. Maybe she was remembering, just not sharing. There's a difference. I remember one evening in particular. I must have been in my 20s by then. Old enough to notice things in a different way. We were sitting together after dinner. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. I had been talking about something, work, I think, or maybe a trip I was planning. She listened the way she always did. Fully. Without interrupting. At one point, I asked her if she had ever wanted to travel more. See different places. She smiled. That would have been nice, she said. Just that. I remember waiting for her to continue. She didn't. And I didn't ask anything more. At the time, it felt like a complete answer. Now it feels like the edge of something. Not a secret she was hiding. Just a story she wasn't offering. I think that's the part one understand now. She wasn't keeping something from us. She was choosing what belonged to us. And what didn't. That's a quiet kind of care. Not everyone does that. Some people carry everything forward. Let it spill into every part of their lives. Their past, their regrets, their what-ifs. She didn't. She kept things in their place. Not out of denial, but out of respect. For the life she had.
For the people in it.
For us. I picked up another letter, one of the last in the stack. The handwriting was steadier again. That caught my attention. There was a calmness to it. A sense that whatever had needed to be decided had already been decided. The words reflected that. Simple.
Clear.
No hesitation. It didn't feel like someone holding on. It felt like someone who had already let go. I read it through once. Then again. And I noticed something small, but important. There was no looking back. No references to what had been, only an acknowledgement of what was. That felt like the final piece I needed. She hadn't told us because, by the time we knew her, this part of her life was no longer something she lived inside. It was something she had lived through. There's a difference. One stays active. The other becomes part of you, but doesn't ask for attention anymore. I closed the letter and placed it back in the box. My hands moved slowly, the way hers used to. Careful. Intentional. I understood her better now. Not completely. I don't think that's ever possible with another person. But enough. Enough to see that her silence wasn't emptiness. It was fullness contained. A life she had chosen to carry in a certain way. Not for herself alone, but for all of us who came after. I closed the lid of the box and rested my hand on top of it. It didn't feel heavy anymore. Just settled. Like something that had found its place. And for the first time since I opened it, I didn't feel the need to ask her why. I think I already knew. After a while, the letters stopped feeling like something I had discovered. They started to feel like something I had been trusted with. That was a quiet shift, not something I decided. It just happened somewhere between one afternoon and the next. I didn't open the box every day anymore. Sometimes I would sit at the table and leave it closed, my hand resting on the lid, the way you might rest your hand on a book you're not quite ready to finish. There was no urgency left in me, only a kind of steady awareness. The house had settled into a different rhythm too. The rooms felt less empty.
Not filled, exactly.
Just less hollow. I began to notice her again. Not in the way I had before, when everything about her felt complete and familiar, but in smaller ways. More layered. I saw her in the kitchen one morning, standing at the sink. Not really there, of course. Just a memory rising up in the right light. She had her sleeves rolled up slightly, the way she always did when she washed dishes. Her hands moving slowly, not because she had to, but because she didn't see a reason to rush. I used to think that was just her way. Now I wondered if it came from something else. From knowing what it meant to take your time, when time once felt uncertain.
I didn't try to answer that.
I just let the thought pass. There were other moments too. The way she used to pause before answering certain questions. Not all questions. Just some. At the time, it felt like she was choosing her words carefully. Now it felt like she was choosing how much of herself to bring into the room. That's different. It takes a kind of awareness to do that. A quiet understanding of what belongs to the present and what doesn't. I hadn't seen it before. Or maybe I had, but I didn't recognize it for what it was. I went back into her bedroom one afternoon. I hadn't spent much time in there since the day I found the box. It felt like a space that needed to settle on its own. The bed was still made the way she always made it. Corners tucked in, blanket pulled smooth. There was a faint crease near the edge where she used to sit. I sat there for a moment. The room was quiet, not heavy, just still. I looked at the dresser.
The drawer.
I walked over and opened it again, slowly this time. It didn't feel like crossing a line anymore. Just returning. The inside looked the same.
Neat.
Ordered. Nothing out of place. The envelopes were still tied together. The handkerchief still folded in the same careful way. I ran my fingers lightly over the fabric. It was soft, even after all these years. I wondered if it had been given to her by someone. That thought would have meant something different to me a few days ago. Now, it didn't need to.
It was just part of her life.
One piece among many. I closed the drawer gently and stood there for a moment longer. Then I turned back toward the table. The box was still there, where I had left it. It didn't call to me anymore. It didn't feel like something waiting to be opened. It felt like something already understood.
Not fully,
but enough. I sat down and opened it anyway, not out of need.
Just to be with it.
I didn't take out any letters this time.
I just looked at them.
The different stacks. The slight variations in paper. The way some were tied, others left loose. Each one had been touched by her hands. Folded. Read.
Put away.
I tried to picture those moments again. Not as something hidden, but as something she returned to when she needed to remember something about herself. That's what it felt like now. Not a secret she kept, but a part of her she visited quietly, without bringing it into the rest of her life. I thought about how we all do that in our own ways. Keep certain memories in places we can reach, but don't always share. Not because we're hiding them, but because they belong to a different time. A different version of who we were. I picked up one letter at random and held it in my hands. I didn't open it. I just felt the weight of it.
Light. Simple.
And yet it carried so much of something that had shaped her. I set it back down and closed the lid. This time, the sound didn't feel like a pause. It felt like a quiet kind of completion. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room. Everything felt the same. And different. The same table. The same walls. The same afternoon light settling in through the window. But I wasn't seeing it the same way. And I wasn't seeing her the same way either. She wasn't just my grandmother anymore. Not in the way I had always understood that word. She was someone who had lived a full life before I ever knew her. Someone who had made choices that shaped everything that came after. Someone who had carried parts of herself quietly, without letting them overshadow the life she built. There was a kind of strength in that. Not loud. Not visible. But steady. I felt something settle in me then. Not an answer. More like an understanding. That I didn't need to know everything. I didn't need to trace every detail, every moment, every reason. What mattered was what I could see now. The shape of her life. The way she had held it together. The way she had given us what she chose to give, fully, and without hesitation. That hadn't been incomplete. It had been intentional. I sat there a while longer, just letting that thought stay where it was. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt layered. As if her presence hadn't left, but had simply shifted into something quieter. Something that didn't need to be seen to be understood. I stood up slowly and picked up the box. For a moment, I considered putting it back in the drawer, returning everything to where it had been. But I didn't do that. Not yet. Instead, I carried it to the shelf in the living room. A place where she used to keep things she cared about. Photographs. Small keepsakes. Things that didn't need to be hidden, but also didn't need to be explained. I set the box there. It looked right. Not out of place. Just part of the room. Part of her. I stepped back and looked at it for a moment. Then I turned away. For the first time since I found it, I didn't feel like I was leaving something unfinished behind. I felt like I was carrying something forward. Not the details. Not the story itself.
Just the understanding.
That people are more than the roles we know them in. And that sometimes the quiet parts of a life are the ones that shape it the most. I didn't tell anyone right away. That decision came quietly. Not something I sat down and worked through. It was just there, settled in the same way everything else had begun to settle. The box stayed on the shelf in the living room. Not hidden. Not displayed in any obvious way either. Just placed among the other things she had kept over the years. A framed photograph. A small ceramic dish with a chip along the edge. A stack of old recipe cards tied together with string. It fit there, as if it had always belonged. I went about my days slowly after that. There wasn't much to do in the house except sort through the usual things.
Clothes.
Papers. Small objects that carry more feeling than purpose. I worked through them one drawer at a time. She had a way of keeping things organized. Not rigidly. Just enough that you could tell she cared about where things were. I found little reminders of her everywhere. A note tucked into a cookbook. A button wrapped in tissue. A list written in her handwriting, neat and steady, even toward the end. Those things felt familiar. Comforting in a quiet way. The letters felt different. Not heavier. Just separate. I thought about them often, even when I wasn't near the box. They didn't demand attention. They didn't ask to be shared. They simply existed the way they always had. One afternoon, my daughter called. We spoke about ordinary things. Her work. The weather where she was. A neighbor she had been helping with something small. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was fine. And I meant it. After a pause, she asked if I had found anything interesting while going through the house. I stood there for a moment, the phone in my hand, looking toward the living room, toward the shelf, toward the box. I could have told her. There was nothing stopping me. It wasn't a secret I had promised to keep. No one had asked me to, but I didn't. Just the usual things, I said. Old papers. Photos.
She seemed satisfied with that.
We talked a little longer, then said goodbye. After I hung up, I stood there for a while, thinking about that moment. It didn't feel like I had hidden something. It felt like I had chosen something. There's a difference. I walked into the living room and stood in front of the shelf. The box looked the same as it had the day before. Simple. Quiet. It didn't carry any sense of urgency. I reached out and rested my hand on top of it. For a moment, I considered opening it again, reading more, looking for something I might have missed. But I didn't. I had already read enough to understand what it was. And what it wasn't. It wasn't a story that needed to be told in full. It wasn't something that would change the way we remembered her in any meaningful way. It was part of her. That was enough. I sat down on the couch and looked around the room. The late afternoon light had started to come in through the window, soft and steady. It reminded me of the way she used to sit here, hands folded in her lap sometimes, other times holding something small, a piece of fabric, a letter, a photograph. I wondered, not for the first time, if she had ever thought about what would happen to those letters after she was gone. If she had expected someone to find them, or if she had simply left them there, knowing that whatever happened next would be enough. I think she trusted that. Not in a formal way, just in the quiet understanding she seemed to carry about most things. That life moves forward, that what needs to remain, remains, and what doesn't, fades on its own. I stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, everything looked the same. The same street, the same trees, the same slow movement of people going about their day. Nothing in the world had changed, and yet, something in me had. Not dramatically, just slightly adjusted, like seeing something from a different angle. I understood now that what we carry forward from the people we love isn't everything they were. It can't be. A whole life doesn't fit neatly into memory. We carry pieces, moments, habits, the way they made us feel in ordinary situations, the way they held a room without saying much. And sometimes we carry things we didn't even know were there until later. The letters were like that. Not something I had lived through, but something that had shaped the person I knew, quietly, without asking to be recognized. I walked back to the shelf and picked up the box. It felt the same in my hands, light, steady. I held it there for a moment, thinking, not about the details, not about the names or the places, just about what it represented. A part of her life that had been real, meaningful, and complete in its own way. I didn't feel the need to explain it to anyone, not because I was protecting her, but because I understood her better now. And that understanding didn't require words. Some things lose their shape when you try to describe them too clearly. They become smaller, simpler than they were. This wasn't something I wanted to reduce like that. I placed the box back on the shelf, carefully, in the same spot. I adjusted it slightly so it sat straight. That felt like something she would have done. Then I stepped back. The room felt calm, settled. I realized then that I had already made my choice. Not in a single moment, but gradually over the past few days. I would keep this with me, not as a secret, but as something understood. Something that didn't need to be passed along in full. If parts of it found their way into stories later, in softer ways, that would be enough. A feeling, a lesson, a quiet awareness that people are more than what we see, that they carry whole lives within them, and that sometimes the most meaningful parts are the ones they choose not to speak about. I sat down again and let that thought settle. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt complete. Not because everything had been explained, but because I no longer needed it to be. I looked once more at the shelf, at the box, at the small collection of things she had left behind, and I understood that what we carry forward isn't just memory. It's perspective, the way we begin to see people more fully, even after they're gone. And in that way, they stay with us, not in pieces, but in quiet, steady understanding. The house is quiet again, not the kind of quiet that feels unfamiliar anymore. It has settled into something I recognize. Something I can move through without stopping at every doorway, without feeling like I've forgotten why I walked into a room. Morning comes the same way it always has. Light through the curtains. The soft sound of something outside. A car passing. A bird settling on the fence. I make coffee. I stand at the counter for a moment before pouring it, just the way she used to. I didn't notice that habit before. There are a lot of things I didn't notice. I carry my cup into the living room and sit down. The chair across from me is still empty, but it doesn't feel as sharp as it did before. It feels expected. I glance toward the shelf without thinking. The box is there. It has become part of the room now. Not something separate. Not something that draws my attention every time I see it. Just present. The way her things always were. I don't open it. I haven't for a few days. Not because I'm avoiding it. Just because I don't feel the need to anymore. There's a difference between curiosity and understanding. Curiosity asks you to keep looking. Understanding lets you stop. I take a sip of coffee. It's a little too hot, like it always is when I don't wait long enough. I set the cup down and rest my hands in my lap. The house holds its quiet. I think about her again, but not in the way I did before. I'm not searching through memories, trying to find something I missed. I'm not replaying conversations or looking for hidden meanings. I'm just remembering her as she was. The way she moved through a room. The way she listened. The way she would pause before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of care.
Those things feel clearer now. Not changed.
Just seen differently. There's a kind of stillness that comes after you understand something you didn't know you were missing. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, then settles. That's what this feels like. I stand up and walk toward the kitchen. The floor makes the same soft sound beneath my feet. The kind of sound you don't hear until everything else is quiet. I rinse my cup in the sink. That's another habit I picked up without realizing it. A quick rinse. Even if I'm going to wash it properly later. I dry my hands and lean against the counter for a moment. The window is open just slightly. Enough to let in a bit of air. I remember her standing here. Not in a distant way. In a present way. As if she's just stepped out of the room for a moment and might come back. But she won't. And that's all right. There's no resistance in that thought anymore. Just acceptance. I walk back into the living room and stop near the shelf again. The box sits where I placed it. It hasn't moved. I reach out and touch it lightly, not to open it, just to feel it there. The wood is smooth beneath my fingers. Familiar now. I think about everything it holds. Not the details. Not the words. Just the weight of a life lived before mine ever touched hers. A life that shaped her in ways I only began to understand at the end. And I realized something I hadn't put into words before. She didn't leave a silence behind because she had something to hide. She left it because not everything needs to be spoken to be real. Some things are carried quietly. Not for secrecy. For balance. I step back and sit down again. The room feels steady. Complete in a way I didn't expect. I think about the stories we tell. The ones we pass on. How we choose them. How we shape them so they fit into the lives we're living now. She did that too. Not by changing the truth, but by deciding which parts belonged in the telling. That's not the same as leaving something out. It's knowing what matters in the moment you're in. I understand that now. More than I did before. I don't feel the need to share everything I found. Not because I'm holding it back, but because I know that what matters most isn't the story itself. It's what it reveals. That people are layered. That they carry entire worlds within them. That love can exist in places that never make it into words. I sit there for a while, letting the quiet stay as it is. It doesn't press on me anymore. It doesn't ask anything of me. It just exists. The way her silence did. I think about how I'll leave this house someday. How someone else might walk through these rooms. Open drawers. Find things I've left behind without meaning to. I wonder what they'll understand. What they won't. And I realize that's all right too. No one ever knows everything about another person. Not even the ones who love them most. We see what we're given. We understand what we can. And the rest stays where it belongs. I look once more at the shelf. At the box. At the small, quiet place it holds in the room. It doesn't feel like an ending. Not really. More like something that has come to rest. I take a slow breath and let it out. The house remains still. But it no longer feels empty. It feels lived in. Not just by the years we shared, but by everything that came before. Everything that shaped her into the person I knew. And everything she chose to give us. Fully and without hesitation. I don't need to open the box again. I don't need to read another letter. What I needed to understand is already here. In the quiet. In the small details. In the way I see her now. Some stories aren't meant to be told out loud. They aren't meant to be passed from one person to another in full. They live in a different way. In how we remember, in how we carry someone forward. I sit there a little longer, then stand up and turn off the lamp. The room dims gently, not all at once. The light from the window is enough. It always is. And as I move through the house, closing doors, straightening small things the way she used to, I realize something simple. Her silence didn't leave something missing. It left something whole. Something that doesn't need to be explained. Only understood. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. Some stories don't come with clear endings. They don't wrap everything neatly or answer every question. They just leave you with a feeling and maybe a different way of seeing the people you thought you already understood. If this story reminded you of someone in your life, someone whose past you never fully knew, take a moment to think about them today. Sometimes, the quiet parts of a person's life are the ones that matter most. And if you haven't already, consider asking a question you've never asked before. Not to uncover everything, just to listen. If this kind of story speaks to you, you can stay a little longer by subscribing to the channel. There are more stories like this, simple, real, and told the way life often unfolds. Take care of the people around you. And don't wait too long to hear what they might be ready to share.